The stagecoach groaned to a halt in a cloud of red dust that hung in the air like a curse refusing to settle. Eleanor Vance pressed a gloved hand to the window frame and peered out at the town of Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, and felt the last fragile thread of her hope fray and snap clean through. The street was little more than a rutted scar between sagging buildings, their gray timbers bleached to the color of old bone by a sun that hung overhead with the merciless intent of a branding iron held too long in the coals. A mangy dog slept in the only patch of shade to be found, ribs rising and falling slow, and a windmill turned without purpose against a sky the color of scorched tin, its blades catching no breeze worth the having. The heat came at her the moment the door swung open, a living thing that pressed against her chest and stole the breath clean from her lungs before she could think to draw it. Che! It carried with it the stench of horse dung baking, hard in the dirt, of stale whiskey leaking from the open mouth of a saloon, of sweat and gun oil, and something deeper underneath it all, a desolation that seemed soaked into the very ground itself, a thing far older than the town that squatted upon it. She had crossed 2,000 miles for this. She had left behind the gray drizzle of Boston, the genteel poverty of her father's bankruptcy, the whispered shame that had clung to the Vance name like soot to a chimney throat, and she had come out here to the raw and lonesome edge of the known world. On the strength of a single letter and a promise that now seemed thin as paper held up to a candle flame. Her traveling dress, a dove-gray silk that had once been the very height of modest fashion in another life, was already filthy at the hem, the fabric clinging damp to her spine, and the fine kid gloves she had saved, and saved, for felt absurd here, like jewels worn into a slaughter yard. She felt the eyes of the whole town settle upon her, the rough men leaning against posts with their thumbs hooked in their belts and their faces unreadable, the women who paused in their errands to study her with frank and pitiless suspicion, taking her measure and finding her wanting. She was a foreign object dropped down into a wound that had never once properly healed, and every instinct she owned screamed up at her that she did not belong, that this country would chew her up and spit out the bones without ever bothering to learn her name. Yet beneath the fear, beneath the trembling that had got into her gloved fingers, there burned a stubborn ember of resolve that not even 2,000 miles of grinding disappointment had managed to smother dead. She had nowhere else left in all the world to go. There was no ship waiting to bear her back, no inheritance held in trust, no soft bed in any house that would still trouble itself to claim her as its own. So she gathered up what dignity the long journey had left her, and she lifted her chin against the weight of all that watching, and she swore in the private dark of her own heart that whatever might happen next, she would not let a single soul in this hard place see her break. She stood in the meager shade of the depot awning for the better part of an hour, her single trunk at her feet like a faithful but useless dog that had followed her too far to be sent home, and she waited for a man she had never once met in the flesh. The letter had spoken of a widower named Caleb Hartright, a rancher of good standing, who sought a wife to share the labor and the loneliness of a life. Lived high on the open plains. And she had read that letter so many times over on the long journey west that the creases had worn near to tearing, and the words themselves had taken on the heavy weight of Scripture. The arrangement had been brokered by a marriage agent down in Cheyenne, a fat man with greasy fingers and a heavy watch chain that strained across the swell of his belly, who had taken her last few coins and assured her with a smile that showed too many teeth by half that Mr. Hartright was a man of honor through and through. She clung to that one word now. Honor, turning it over and over in her mind like a smooth river stone worried in the bottom of a pocket. The sun climbed higher and the shade shrank, until it abandoned her entirely, retreating across the gray boards like a tide going slowly out and leaving her stranded on the dry sand of the afternoon. Flies found her soon enough, settling at the wet corners of her eyes and along the damp of her neck, and she had not the spirit left to wave them off. A drunkard staggered close enough that she could smell the sourness coming off him in waves, his eyes crawling slow over her like fingers before a barkeep in a blood and grease-stained apron leaned out and shouted him off with a word she did not know the meaning of. No carriage came rattling up the rutted street. No fine rancher in a clean black coat strode up to claim her with a courtly tip of his hat. and a kindly word of welcome. Doubt began to gnaw at the frayed edges of her resolve, sharp little teeth that found out every weak and tender place she had. Perhaps the agent had lied about a great deal more than she had yet come to understand. Perhaps Mr. Hartright had ridden in early, taken one long look at the dust and ruin of her arrival, and decided in his heart she was not worth the long trip back into the hills. Perhaps she would simply be left here to rot, a woman alone, with no money and no name in a town that ate the helpless whole and buried them shallow in the sage. She straightened her spine against the cold of that thought, lifted her chin once again, and forced herself to breathe slow. And even the way her late mother had patiently taught her to do before a piano recital in those gentler years, counting the breaths in, holding them a moment, letting them go. The town watched her wait, and she felt the watching of it, like a flat hand laid between her shoulder blades, pressing. The mountains away to the west sat blue and indifferent on the horizon, vast and ancient and utterly silent. And they seemed to whisper to her across all those long, empty miles that her small troubles meant exactly nothing at all out here, that the land had swallowed sorrows far bigger than hers, without so much as a ripple to mark the place. She had never in all her days felt so small, nor, strangely enough, so stubbornly determined to refuse that smallness its easy victory over her. He came on foot, leading a horse, and she nearly missed him entirely, among the other rough men of the street, because he made no noise and asked for no notice, the way the most dangerous things in nature so seldom ever do. He was tall and lean, built like something carved straight out of the same hard country that surrounded them on every side. His shoulders set with the weariness of a man who had carried a great weight for far too long and had finally stopped expecting to ever set it down. His clothes were the dull brown of dried mud and long-worn leather, the coat patched at one elbow with thread that did not quite match the cloth, the boots cracked and gone gray with the dust that had worked itself down into the very grain of them over years. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face so that she saw at first only the hard line of a jaw gone several days without the touch of a razor, and the cold glint of eyes, the color of weathered slate, eyes that had plainly looked upon a great many hard things. He stopped at careful and deliberate distance from her, the horse's reins held loose in one scarred and weathered hand, and he studied her, the slow way a man studies a sky full of weather he does not trust, weighing it, measuring it, reckoning what it might yet cost him before it cleared. The silence stretched out long between them, thick and uncomfortable as wet wool against the skin, until she could bear the weight of it no longer, and her voice came out of her smaller than she had wished it would. She asked him if he was Mr. Hartright. He said that he was, in a voice like gravel, turning slow in a creek bed, low and rough from long disuse, as though each word had to be dug up by hand from somewhere deep and stony inside him. Then he looked down at her trunk and at her thin silk slippers, already ruined, past saving by the dust, and at the pale, uncalloused skin of her wrists, where the kid gloves ended, and something crossed his weathered face that might have been disappointment or might have been only simple resignation. The worn look of a man finding one more thing gone wrong in a long and unbroken line of things gone wrong. He did not offer her his hand. He did not offer a single word of welcome. He told her instead that there had been a mistake, that the agent down in Cheyenne had no right under heaven to promise any wedding, that he had only ever asked after a housekeeper, a woman to cook and to tend the place and keep it from falling down around him, and that the fat man had gone and dressed the plain thing up as something it was not, the very way a crooked horse trader paints fresh over a swayback to fetch a better price. The words landed on her like cold water flung hard from a bucket, and she felt her face go still and careful, even as her stomach dropped clean through the depot boards. She understood then, all at once, that she had crossed an entire continent in pursuit of a lie, that there would be no marriage, no security, no roof on this earth she could ever rightly call her own, nothing waiting for her at the end of it but the uncertain charity of a hard stranger who plainly wished, with all his heart, that she had stayed wherever it was she had come from. The first complication arrived, close upon the heels of the second, when she learned there was no wagon to be had. He had ridden into town on the single horse, a rangy bay gelding with a white blaze down his face and patient dark eyes, because the buckboard's axle had cracked clean through the week prior, on a rocky grade, and he had neither the money for a new one nor the time to ride the long miles needed to fetch the parts. He told her this flat and plain, without a word of apology, watching her face the whole while for the breakdown he so plainly expected to come. Now the tears and the wailing and the shrill demand. A lesser woman, a softer woman, raised gentle and kept gentle all her days, might have wept right then, might have sunk down upon the trunk and refused to move another inch, might have demanded to be taken at once to a hotel and put upon the very next coach, headed back toward the civilization she had so foolishly abandoned. Eleanor felt the urge to do exactly that, rise up hot and choking in her throat, felt the sharp sting of it gathering behind her eyes. But she had 30 cents to her entire name, a true and bitter accounting she had made twice over, and no civilization left anywhere upon the whole turning earth that would trouble itself to have her back. And she understood with a brutal and clarifying calm that her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford to carry. So, she swallowed it down whole, the way she had swallowed down so much else already on this long road. She asked him how far the ranch lay from town, keeping her voice carefully level, and he said better than half a day's hard ride up into the foothills, with weather maybe coming on before they made it. She looked at the single horse and then down at her own impractical silk dress and her ruined slippers, and she made her choice without once letting herself dwell upon it. She said that she would ride. She said it plainly and clear, without complaint, without so much as a tremor to betray her. And she saw the flicker of genuine surprise move through his slate-colored eyes, a brief flaring of something that was not quite respect, but stood waiting patient in its doorway. He had expected her to fold up like wet paper in the rain. She had refused him, the satisfaction of it, and meant to keep on refusing. He helped her to clamber up onto the trunk so that she might mount behind the saddle, and his hands were careful and impersonal where they steadied her waist, lifting her without lingering a heartbeat longer than the task required. And he kept a polite and deliberate distance from her even in that necessary closeness. She arranged her ruined skirts as best she could over the gelding's warm and shifting flank and gripped hard at the high cantle of the saddle. And as the town of Bitter Creek began to fall away behind them into its own red dust, she felt the first strange flicker of her own buried strength stirred to life in her chest, surprising and unwelcome, and somehow welcome all at once, like a green shoot, pushing stubborn up through dead ground that everyone with sense had long since given over for barren. The town's clamor died away quickly behind them, swallowed whole and silent by the sheer immensity of the land, the way a small stone is swallowed by a deep and still pond. Within an hour, there was nothing left in all the world but the creak of saddle leather, the steady, patient fall of the gelding's hooves upon the dry trail, the endless rasp of wind moving through sage and bunch grass, with a sound like the whole wide world slowly breathing out. The country opened up around them in long, slow waves of gold and rust and faded green, rolling away mile upon mile, toward mountains that never once seemed to draw any nearer, no matter how long or how hard the two of them rode toward them. Eleanor had never in all her sheltered city life so much as imagined a space so vast that it made a plain mockery of distance itself. In Boston, the sky had been a narrow gray ribbon, glimpsed between rooftops and crowded chimney pots. Out here, it was a whole ocean turned clean upside down, an aching, boundless blue dome that pressed the very breath out of her lungs with the sheer crushing scale of it. She felt herself dwindling beneath that sky, reduced to a single trembling speck, riding upon the broad brown hide of some great sleeping giant. And yet there was a terrible and altogether unexpected beauty in the thing that she could not deny, no matter how she tried to harden herself against it. The slanting afternoon light came pouring down through high, thin clouds in great golden columns and gilded the grass to bronze and burning copper, and the shadows of the clouds ran like dark animals loose across the rolling hills. Hawks wheeled in slow, patient circles upon the rising heat, calling out once, and then twice more as lonely as far-off church bells on a Sunday. The man riding before her sat easy and watchful in the saddle, his eyes never once still for a single moment, reading the land all around them in a silent language she did not yet know and could not even name, marking out the low places where shadow pooled, blue in the draws where the trail thinned away to nothing, across broad shelves of broken rock, where the wind carried the faint scent of water, or else of something a man ought to be wary of. He sat the horse as though he had been born up in the saddle and never once climbed down out of it, his competence so complete and so wholly quiet that it required no display, no boasting, no backward glance to see whether or not she admired it. She found herself studying the set of his broad shoulders against the light, the careful economy of his every small movement, the way his scarred hands held the reins loose and sure as breathing. And her fear began, slowly and entirely against her own will, to braid itself together with something far closer to plain curiosity. He was hard, this man, and silent as the very mountains that sat watching them, both from the far horizon, but there was nothing cruel in his silence, nothing in it that wished her any kind of harm at all. It was simply the quiet of a man who had run clean out of things worth the saying, and had made his own long peace with the running out of them. And that, she found to her surprise, was a thing she could begin to understand. Near the midpoint of the long journey, with the sun beginning its slow-burning slide down toward the western peaks, he reined the gelding to a halt in the cool shade of a lone cottonwood that stood guard over a thin silver trickle of spring water threading down through the rocks. He swung down out of the saddle without a word and reached up to help her to the ground, and her legs had gone so numb and stiff from the long ride that she stumbled hard when her feet touched the earth, and he steadied her at once with one strong hand laid at her elbow, his grip sure and warm and steady, releasing her again, the very instant she found her own footing, as though the touch itself had cost him something dear he could not well afford to spend. He uncorked a battered tin canteen and held it out to her, and when she hesitated, mindful of taking what little he plainly had, he told her gruffly to go on and drink, that the dry country would take more out of a body than the body ever rightly knew, until it was too late to make it good. The water was warm and tasted faintly of tin and leather and old canvas, and it was in that single moment the very finest thing she had ever swallowed in all the days of her life. She drank deep of it, and then she made herself stop before she emptied it dry, thinking of the long miles still ahead of them both, and the tired horse that would surely need it too. And she handed the canteen back to him, and that small, unexpected act of restraint earned her another of those brief, unreadable glances, longer this time, and waited with something she could not yet name. He gave her a strip of dried meat from out of his saddlebag, hard and dark and salty against her tone, and a heel of bread gone stale at the edges, and the two of them ate together in a companionable silence beneath the cottonwood, while the broad leaves whispered and turned overhead in the wind, showing their pale silver undersides like 1,000 small flags of surrender. Then, looking out at the long miles still ahead of them, rather than at her, his jaw working a moment before the words finally came loose, he said in his low, rough voice that he was sorry for the heat that had no mercy in it anywhere. Sorry for the lie the agent down in Cheyenne had told to fill his own greasy pockets. Sorry that she had come so terribly far for so very little waiting at the end of it. It was the most words he had strung together at one time since the depot back in town, and they seemed to cost him dearly in the spending, each one dragged up by main force from some buried and stony place down inside him. She told him gently that it was none of his doing, that he had been deceived just as surely and just as cruelly as she had been herself. He shook his head slow and said that it was his name, signed at the bottom of that letter, his own hand, that had set the whole sorry thing in motion, and so it was his shame to carry the rest of his days. And a man owned up to his shame, or else he was no kind of man at all worth the name. And in that small and honest exchange, beneath that one lonely tree set in the very middle of all that vast emptiness, with the spring water murmuring soft over the stones at their feet, the first thin, shining thread of trust spun itself quietly into being, between two weary people who had each expected nothing whatsoever from the other but trouble and fresh disappointment. Twilight was bleeding, violet and rose across the foothills when the homestead at last came into view, and Eleanor's heart, which had buoyed itself up so hopefully on the unexpected kindness back beneath the cottonwood, sank low and cold once more at the bare sight of it. It was so small, so very, very small. A low cabin of weathered logs squatted against a rise of land, like something trying its best to hide itself away from the wind, its sod roof sagging deep in the middle, its single window dark and empty as a blind eye staring out at nothing. A leaning barn stood off to one side of it, and a few sorry outbuildings beyond that, and corral pens whose fences had gone gray and broken in a dozen places, the rails fallen down or rotted clean through with neglect. Beyond them all, the empty land rolled on toward the darkening mountains, holding nothing at all that she could see. There were no cattle anywhere upon it, only a handful of dusty chickens scratching listless in the bare yard, and a single bony milk cow standing forlorn within a corral, lowing softly at their slow approach. This was not the prosperous spread the agent had painted up so fine with his greasy, smiling words. This was a place that a man had been losing, slow and grinding an inch by bitter inch, for a long and lonely while, a place that had been quietly bleeding itself out into the indifferent soil for years on end. She understood it all in the single moment she truly saw it. Understood at long last the patches on his worn coat and the cracked gray boots and the 30 cents that no doubt mirrored her own 30 cents down to the penny to do. Understood that Caleb Hartright was no rancher of good standing at all, but a man holding on by his torn and bleeding fingernails to something that was slipping forever away from him with every passing season of the year. He swung down from the gelding and reached up and lifted her after him down to the ground. And then he stood for a long silent moment looking out at his own slow ruin through what she imagined must surely be her own eyes, now seeing it freshly and whole the way a stranger comes to see a thing, and his jaw tightened down hard and a muscle jumped there. In his weathered cheek, he did not apologize this time. He had run clean dry of all his apologies, somewhere back along the dusty trail. He simply turned and led the tired horse off toward the leaning barn and told her over his shoulder, in his gravel voice, that she could take the cabin for her very own and that he himself would sleep up in the cold loft above the barn, and that there was a stout wooden bar she could drop across the cabin door from the inside if it would let her rest the easier through the night. That bar across the door undid something deep in her that the whole long, cruel day had not once managed to touch. She had braced herself somewhere down in the locked, dark cellar of her mind for exactly the kind of arrangement that men were so well known to make with women they had paid good money to fetch clear across a whole continent. She had readied herself through all those long miles to fight tooth and nail, if it came to that, or else to grit her teeth hard and endure what simply could not be fought against. And instead, this gruff and ruined stranger had handed her the one cabin, with a roof that still held against the weather, had taken the cold, drafty loft for himself without a single word of complaint, and had told her plain how to lock him out of her sight, come the night, where, as though her safety and her peace of mind mattered more to him than his own comfort or his pride ever could. When she stepped at last through the low door into the cabin, she found a fire already laid and lit and burning steady upon the stone hearth, its warm orange light dancing and leaping across the spare little room, chasing the shadows up the rough log walls. And there upon the rough plank table sat a covered crock of beans, gone fragrant with bacon fat, and a heel of dark bread, and a tin cup of milk still faintly warm from the cow. He had done every bit of this before he ever rode the long way into Bitter Creek to fetch her, had labored to make this poor place ready to welcome a woman he had never once laid his eyes upon, and the unspoken care in it sat strange and tender against his hard silence, the way a single wildflower sits strange and bright among gray rocks. Over the days that slowly followed, a wordless rhythm established itself between the two of them. Careful as the steps of a dance, neither would dare to name aloud. Each gray dawn, she would wait to find that he had already been and gone, had left fresh, foaming milk and a few warm brown eggs upon her step, sat down soft without a knock or a word of greeting, and she would hear him already hard at his work out in the yard, the steady ringing bite of his axe into wood, the patient rasp of his saw across green timber, the low, gentling murmur of his voice, as he talked, easy and quiet, to the milk cow. He labored from the first gray light of morning clear, until full dark came down over the hills with a relentless, almost animal endurance that frightened her some to watch mending fence and hauling water and splitting wood and digging hard at the frozen ground, fighting back against the slow, grinding tide of ruin with nothing in all the world to his name but the strength of his own two scarred hands. He asked nothing whatsoever of her. Not a word, not a single chore, not one thing. He simply provided what little he could and let her be. And there was a kind of bruised and battered honor living in that which she had not once in all her life known a man could carry within him. She did not let herself simply be for very long. Idleness, she had learned hard in the dark Boston years, was its own slow and certain kind of dying, and Eleanor Vance had not crossed 2,000 bitter miles only to wither and go gray in a borrowed cabin, while a good man broke his back in the cold beyond her clean-scrubbed window. She began with the cleaning, scrubbing years of cake grime from the little window until the evening light poured through it gold and clean, sweeping out the long drifts of dust and the dry mouse leavings from the corners, ordering the spare little space into something that breathed and lived and welcomed. Then she went further than that, because there was a good deal more in her than mere scrubbing ever could use up. She had never told him, had never once told another living soul in all her wandering, of the long years she had spent quietly keeping her father's books in the back office before the firm collapsed at last into shame. The heavy leather ledgers she had balanced through the small dark hours of the night, while her father drank himself stupid and weeping in the next room, over the long columns of figures that lived on, yet in her head, with a perfect cold clarity. Even now, one gray afternoon, she found his accounts crammed all anyhow into a battered tin box up on a high shelf, a hopeless chaos of unpaid notes and creased receipts and debts scrawled on the backs of old feed bills, and within a single hour she had seen the whole sorry shape of his slow drowning laid bare before her. The precise and patient way the cattle buyer down in the valley had been cheating him on weight and on price. For years on end, the one banknote that could yet be saved entire if it were only approached at the right time and in just the right way. She mended his torn shirts in the evenings by the firelight with stitches finer and truer than any garment of his had ever known in its life. She gathered wild herbs from the sheltered draws, as her grandmother had patiently taught her in another and gentler life, and hung them to dry in fragrant bunches from the smoke-dark rafters overhead. And one cold evening, she carried a tin cup of fresh hot coffee out to where he labored at a fence line in the failing light and set it down upon a fence post without a word between them, and met his startled slate eyes for one long-held heartbeat, and then turned and walked back toward the cabin. But, and it was not subservience in that small act, but a quiet declaration of her own presence there, a planting of her own flag deep in the hard ground of his life. The night the trouble truly began, he had finally spoken aloud the words that set her free. He had drawn the marriage agent's lying contract out from the tin box and fed it slow into the hungry mouth of the fire, watching it curl and blacken and twist, and told her in his gravel voice that she was no man's bought property, and never once would be, that she was free as the wind itself to leave come the spring thaw, but that the long winter road would surely kill her dead before she reached it, and that he would not have that weight laid upon his soul. He framed her staying not as any right of his own, but as her free and unforced choice to make. And she had chosen, there in the warm, crackling silence of the cabin, without ever once saying the word of it aloud, to stay. The riders came out of a howling white blizzard 3 weeks on, 4 of them looming up out of the driving snow, like ghosts that had been given guns. Hired killers sent up from the valley by the cattle buyer, whose long quiet theft she had uncovered down in the tin box and reported in a careful letter to the territorial marshal up in the capital. A letter Caleb had written 2 cold and bitter days through the weather to post. They came to silence forever, the only 2 living souls in all the world who knew the whole truth of the matter, and they came clever about it, with the screaming storm at their backs, to muffle their approach and to cover over their tracks after the work was done. Caleb saw them first through the swirling white and shoved her hard back toward the cabin door and snatched up his old long rifle from the pegs above the hearth. And that was the very moment Eleanor Vance let the last of her careful masks fall away and shatter clean upon the floor. She had never told him, never told a single soul west of Boston, that her father, in the good years before the drink had taken him down, had taught his only child to shoot straight and true, that she could put a lead ball clean through the center of a playing card at 40 paces with a steady hand and not a tremor. that her uncanny steadiness with a long gun was the one true inheritance. The bankruptcy and the shame had somehow failed to strip away from her. She reached up and took the second rifle down from its pegs above the hearth, and turned and met his astonished, disbelieving stare full on, and told him simply and clear over the howl of the wind that she could shoot and shoot well, and that he had best trust her now and ask all his questions later, if they both should live to ask and answer them. They fought the storm and the four killers together through that long, screaming, endless night, and they found to their wonder that they did not need words between them at all, not a single one. She held the barn side of the yard while he held the cabin. She anticipated each move that he made before ever he made it, as though some unseen thread ran taut between their two minds. Twice she dropped a man creeping in low on his blind side with the snow swirling thick, and twice he did the very same for her without once being asked. Between the two of them, they turned that frozen yard into a killing ground the gunman could not hope to cross and live. By the gray and exhausted dawn, the threat lay broken and still and half buried in the drifting snow, and the two of them sat shaking and spent before the rebuilt fire. And in the deep, quiet lull that always follows hard upon violence, he told her at last about his first wife. Dead of a sudden, fever 3 hard winters back, while he rode flat out through the dark for a doctor who came a full day too late to do anything more than stand bareheaded over her fresh grave. He told her how he had simply stopped speaking after that, because there had been no living soul left in the world worth the speaking to, and how he had let the ranch fall slowly to ruin all around him, because some buried part of him had wanted only to lie down and die in the cold along with it. She held his scarred and trembling hand in both of hers, and told him in her turn her own long-buried griefs, the shame and the drink and the loneliness that had hollowed out her years, and the high wall that had stood so long between them came down all at once, like rotten fence in a spring flood. And when the spring at last came green and soft to the foothills, she did not return to the cabin alone, nor take the long road back to Bitter Creek and whatever might lie beyond it. She had rebuilt his ruined books, and then his ruined fences, and then somehow, against all the long odds the hard country could throw down before her, the ruined man himself. And one warm and golden evening, as the two of them stood side by side, looking out across cattle grazing fat and content upon land, come fully back to life, he said, low and rough, that the whole place had been dead as a stone, until the very day she walked into it out of the dust, and that he reckoned now he had been dead right along with it, in Eleanor Vance, who had come west on the strength of a lie and had stayed for the slow, hard truth of it, simply leaned her weight into the hard, warm shelter of him and watched the sun go down red and easy over everything the two of them had saved together.